and something you don't want to hear. So always the great way to start off a lesson, right? But it's something that's needed. And it's something that in this particular series of lessons where we're talking about it's all about him, it's honestly the lesson you should have expected to come. Because it is one of those lessons that honestly it just kind of hits you in the stomach. At least it does me, because what we're going to talk about today is something I am particularly not good at. And it is the idea of choosing God over people. Last week we talked about choosing God over stuff. And that's very easy to wrap your brains around because we know life is not about stuff. And while practically speaking that's sometimes difficult, we do tend to like our stuff. We can't really justify stuff. We know it's just things. But when it comes to people, you can justify people. It is very easy to see the value and the role that people play in our lives. So the idea of choosing God over people, while that is something intellectually we know is true, it is something that it is hard to wrap your heart around. But I think it is something that we need to face when it comes to choosing God above all other things. The examples are plenty through Scripture, that God requires everything, even requires us over people. You look at probably one of the most famous stories. What story probably popped into your head before any other story? If I were to ask, is there a story where God demanded that he be put over a person, that he be more valuable than some person? We're all going to think of Abraham offering Isaac over in Genesis chapter 22, where it specifically says in the story that God saw how much Abraham loved his only son, and therefore God says, hey, I want you to go out in the wilderness to this mountain, and I want you to take Isaac with you, and I want you to slaughter him on an altar in sacrifice, in service to me, to prove that you will put me over even the son that you love more than any other thing. And we know the story turns where Abraham does obey. He does take his son out in the wilderness, and while his hand is in the air with the knife about to come down and slaughter his only son in service to God, God stops him. If you turn there in Genesis chapter 22, there's this statement that is made right at the end of that story. Genesis chapter 22 says, starting in verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. Back in verse 12. Then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. Listen to this. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Now that you have been willing to give what is most precious to you to me, I know that you fear me, that you love me, that you are in awe of me, that you put me before any other. That's what Abraham proves to God. Joseph himself, later in the same book, loses everything. Everything. We know the story. His brothers, in a bad series of events, his brothers sell him into slavery. God lifts him up in his slave owner's house, but then he gets thrown into jail because he's falsely accused of seducing his master's wife. But then he gets raised up to be second in command of the whole kingdom of Egypt. When his family comes to live in Egypt because of the massive famine that happened, it says that when his father died, his brothers got scared. They thought for sure this is the time where Joseph is going to come back and he is going to get his revenge and he is going to kill us because of the bad things that we have done to him. But I like the way Joseph says it. This is chapter 50, verse 19 and 20. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will take care of you and your children." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You know, Joseph, while he might not have known it at the time when he was essentially he was being sacrificed. At the time when he lost everything, he lost his family, he lost his position of preference in his own father's family. He lost everything that he probably had planned for his future. He lost everything. At the end of his life, he said, you know what? God took it. And that's okay. Because God did it for what God knew was good. Samuel is given by his own mom in service to the temple. She takes her son, the son whom she has prayed for year after year after year, being barren and unable to provide her husband children. She prays, God, if you'll just give me a child, I will give him to you. God does give her a child, and she gives that child to God. She loses what is most precious to her. The prophets oftentimes, through their stories, lost their communities. They lost their livelihood. Even many of them lost their lives in an effort to deliver God's message, in an effort to be obedient to what God had called them to do. They were willing to give everything, whether that be stuff or whether that be people, family, community. They gave it all in service for God. You have over in Ezra chapter 10 the story of those who were left behind during the captivity, that when they are confronted with the law, that they had broken the law, they divorced their wives in obedience to the law, and they decided to put away the people who were precious to them in service to God. You have the apostles who left everything to follow Jesus. You've got the story in Matthew chapter 4 where they left their nets, their family, their livelihood. They left everything to go and follow Jesus. The rich young ruler told the same thing. He said, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? What do I still lack? What is it that I haven't accomplished? I've kept the law. I've done right things. I've been obedient. What is it that I still need to do? And Jesus says, you need to leave everything. Give it all up and follow me. And it says that he went away sorrowful because he was unwilling to give up his possessions because he had many of them. I imagine that wasn't just possession, but it was home, it was family, it was everything that he had that was good in his life. He was being asked to sacrifice all of it in service to God, and he was unwilling to do it. And this is the same message that we have delivered to us over and over and over again. Turn with me over to Luke chapter 14. I want to look at just 4 examples of the commandments of Jesus in regards to this topic. Luke chapter 14, you've got this section here that my Bible subheads, the cost of following Jesus. That's the way it entitles it. Look with me here in verse 25. Now great crowds were traveling with Jesus. So he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now let me tell you, in the context of the way that teaching is introduced, what Luke is sharing with us is that Jesus just taught something incredibly unpopular. He was popular. Great crowds were following him. So he turns and he tells them this. I'm going to tell you something you don't want to hear. I'm going to share with you the level of commitment that I require. If you're going to follow after me and be one of my disciples, you have to leave everything, even people. Look at the next one, Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. We'll start reading here, verse 18. Similar subheading in my Bible, the cost of following Jesus. And it says, when Jesus saw a large crowd around him, he gave the order to go to the other side of the sea. A scribe approached him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus told him, foxes have dens, and birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay down his head. Lord, another of his disciples said, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus says, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. You see what he's saying here? You give up home, you even give up family. You give up whatever is necessary to give up in order to follow Jesus. Next passage, Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 32. Therefore, everyone who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. Don't assume that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword, for I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. The one who loves a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The one who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever takes up his cross to follow me, or who doesn't take up his cross and follow me, is not worthy of me. Anyone who finds his life will lose it, and anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. Again, same sort of language, same sort of commitment level, same sense of you give everything up to follow me. This is incredibly unpopular. A little later in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37. Matthew 22 and verse 37 gives us that great commandment. He said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets depend on these two commands. Now you could take this same idea and even compare it to passages like Matthew chapter 12 at the end of the chapter where his mother and his brothers have come to see Jesus, and somebody comes in while he's teaching and says, hey, Jesus, your mom and your brothers are outside. And what's he say? No, these are my mothers and my brothers and my sisters, the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. He redefined what family is. Family is no longer about blood, it's about his blood. Those are hard teachings, are they not? It is hard to wrap your brain around the idea that Jesus demands everything. Everything. Even the things that we would deem as being good, the things that we would say are the positive things of life, the things that we would say are good for us. We look at those things and we say, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with family. There's nothing wrong with being a good father. There's nothing wrong with putting a great emphasis on family life and those sorts of things. And there is if it takes the place of God. There is if it becomes more important to us than our relationship with God. And I think sometimes we can be guilty of that. It becomes so easy to make family God, or to make people God. So my question becomes for you, and it's just a simple question for you to consider today as we start to try to really dig into what's being said here. Who do you love more than Jesus? Who? See, here's the hard thing to swallow. Jesus gave up everything for you. Everything. What is it that Jesus held on to that was more important than his relationship with you? I mean, he not only left the glory of heaven, he not only left the conveniences, how great it was to exist there in heaven, where there is no crying and there is no death and there's no inconveniences of life and there's no pain and no sorrow and all of these things that make this life difficult. Jesus gave up all of the good to come down and experience the bad for you. He gave up the riches of heaven for you. So who are we to hold on to stuff and not him? Jesus, who had never, as far as we have any revelation about it whatsoever, been separated from his Father before, came to this earth and separated himself from his Father. I mean, I don't, we talked about this in a recent sermon, I don't know or have any sort of real comprehension of what existence after this earth is like. We're not told. The best we've got is John saying, we don't know. We know that when he appears, we will be like him because we will see him as he is, over in 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. That's all we know. We know that we will exist as he exists. And existence in heaven is dramatically different than existence here. But here's what I want you to understand. Jesus gave up the existence he had in heaven. He emptied himself, Paul says over in Philippians chapter 2, and became like a man. He no longer existed in the heavenly realm. He no longer had whatever that is, whatever that's like. He no longer existed in the presence of God the way he had always existed in the presence of God, because he came and he existed here, like us. He separated himself from his Father. For over 30 years, he lived separated from his Father in a way, as far as we know, he had never been separate from his Father before. He left his Father behind so that he could come and serve us. So what human relationship is more important than, so important that we can't leave it behind to serve him? Any? Because I can't come up with one. You know, maybe you would argue a spouse. And I will say the Bible puts a great emphasis on marriage and the importance of that marriage relationship, and that it is the greatest relationship you can have on earth. We're told over in Deuteronomy chapter 24 that when a Jewish man and a Jewish woman married, they were to take a year away from many of the responsibilities that filled the lives of Jewish men. He was to take a year away in order to do nothing but make her happy. That's a pretty big deal. Speaking of, we still have more honeymooning to do if that's the way this goes. You know, that's a big deal. I find it interesting over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in a passage about marriage, it makes this statement. It says here that, starting in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. However, if you do get married, you've not sinned. For if the virgin marries, she's not sinned. But such people will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. This is what I mean, brothers and sisters. The time is limited. So from now on, those who have wives should be as those who had none, those who weep as those who did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not own anything, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. For the world in its current form is passing away. I want you to be without concern. The unmarried man is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But the married man is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. Now notice, it doesn't say that's sinful. It doesn't say it's wrong for a man to have his interest divided between pleasing the Lord and pleasing his wife. It is the only relationship I know of in Scripture where God does say it is good to have your interest divided so that you may please your wife. God cares about marriage, but God still remains above it. God still demands to be more important than marriage. It is so easy because the marriage relationship is important. And because the marriage relationship is tangible, you can reach out and touch your spouse. It is a very present part of life. We see one another every single day. It is so easy to desire to please your spouse more than to please any other. And it is so easy to let your spouse, in a sense, become the only one you care about pleasing. And I caution you about that. Jesus said, if you love wife or children more than me, then you are not worthy of me. I ask you, do you do the work of thinking about how may I please God more than I even please my spouse? It's a hard question to ask. But we need to be willing to ask it. Children are the same way. Children are consuming. I mean, they take up a lot of time. I don't say that with as much disgust as it sounds like I'm saying it with. I mean, they're a blessing. They are a gift from the Lord. I don't doubt that at all. Psalm 127 is abundantly clear that children are a wonderful blessing. And they are. I've got 5 wonderful children. But those 5 wonderful children do take up a lot of time and attention. And they should. I mean, I have a task before me. I have 18 years with each child in my home, Lord willing, that's all we've got. But 18 years with each child in my home where I need to train them. I need to raise them up. I'm raising adults. I'm raising those who are supposed to go out in the world and make a difference. And ideally make a difference for God in the world. That's what we want to see happen. That's what we're working toward. But it can also become where we care more about keeping our children happy than we do about keeping our God happy. Life can become consumed with chasing your children around from one activity to the next. And now, we've got a scheduling conflict, so who are we going to put first? Child or God? And that's a difficult thing to live through. But God should come first. In every scenario, in every circumstance, no matter what the decision is that needs to be made, you need to be able to say without hesitation, we are going to do this because that's what God would want us to do. And I'm sorry if that upsets you. That has to be the decision that we make every time, or our children learn that it is okay to put God aside in certain circumstances or for certain scheduling conflict. No! God should always be first, because life is not about achieving things on this earth, and it's not about accolades, and it's not about winning tournaments, and it's not about having all these extra things and medals on the wall and plaques and certificates and all of that. That life isn't about those things. Life is about serving God while we are here so that we can live with God when we go there. That's what it's about, nothing else. And we do our family a disservice when we get that out of whack. What about friends? It can become so easy to put God aside for the sake of friends. Well, you know, I've got friends that have come into town and they have a certain expectation of what we're going to do, and so I need to, you know, it's only one Sunday or one Wednesday night or one this or one that. It's no big deal. It is a big deal if you're putting God aside. The missed opportunity might not be, but the attitude of pushing God to the side for the sake of putting someone else as more important than God, that is always a big deal. I relate this to Adam and Eve in the garden. You know, eating a piece of fruit, not a big deal. But choosing what you want over what God says you should want, always a big deal. The problem in the garden was not the activity, it was the rebellion. And when we get that out of whack, when we let our activity or our friends or our family or whoever it is become more important than the motivation or the desire to serve and love God, we are doing wrong. And we are hurting ourselves in our relationship with our God. We are showing God that we are not willing to carry a cross and that we are not willing to love Him before others. You know, the truth is, people are just people. Now, that doesn't mean they're not important. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about them. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek opportunities to serve others. It doesn't mean that those relationships aren't important to us and shouldn't take a high place in our lives and in the way that we make decisions. But people are still just people. They are not God. And I tell you, one of the things I've said over the years that I keep coming back to whenever I think about this is that I need to prioritize people, but not the way we normally think about it. We normally think prioritize people, family, then friends, or people who are most important to us, and then acquaintances, and then strangers, and we got this hierarchy of how important people are in our lives. I would argue with that. The people who are most important to you should be the people that you plan to spend eternity with. Those are the most important people. That's why Jesus could say, "Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters?" there at the end of Matthew 12. It is those who do the will of my Father. Why? They are my eternal relationships. That's why they are most important. And let me be blunt here. If somebody is not an eternal relationship, then you need to seek to make them an eternal relationship if you want them to be that important in your life. And then you think of the intimate relationships. And then you think of the other thing. We need to be the kind of people who are willing to put relationships in their place. Because all relationships, they're just, I put deficient up there, but maybe a better word is broken. Your relationship with God is perfect. Your relationship with people is not. And when you choose to put something imperfect before the one who is perfect, you will never come out ahead, ever. Because God is more important. Again, like I said, not the most popular sermon in the world. But I do think it's something we need to hear. because it is so important that we keep God first, even above the people. It's all about Him. It's not about me, not about you, it's not about them. It's all about Him. And if we can remember that, then we can do well in our relationships on earth. If you're not a child of God, let me tell you, that's where you need to be thinking and praying and dwelling on and studying, because you are not in an eternal relationship with anybody. If you are not a child of God, you do not have the eternal benefits that come from belonging to God, knowing that you are, having that assurance and that confidence that you are going to heaven, that you get to spend eternity with Him and with His people. And I'd encourage you to let that be the thing.